Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again with another video, and today I'm setting up my reading journal for March with all of the spreads that I include in my monthly setups, my cover page, my books read, my stats, and then of course all of my individual book entries. I'll also be sharing my thoughts on all of the books that I read this month, whether I'd recommend them or not, my ratings, all of that good stuff. So get cozy, grab a warm beverage, maybe some tea or coffee, maybe pull out your own reading journal and hang out with me while I chat about my reading in March. Starting with my cover page as per usual, and I definitely wanted to go with a really dark, almost spooky vibe for March. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just winter clinging on with a death grip here in Canada, but I wasn't feeling quite ready for spring vibes for this setup. I actually made this cover page and one of the book entries for this month on a live stream with my patrons, which was lots of fun. Live streams are always a fun time for everyone involved, usually very chill and casual. So if you're interested in seeing me creating spreads real time, if you're interested in hanging out with me and fellow patrons, the link is in the description box to join the squad. Moving on to my March overview of the books I read, there's something satisfying about seeing the covers of all the books I read in a month on a single spread at a glance, as well as my ratings. It's just a nice summary for the month. I asked in my 2022 reading journal flip through video, which I'll link for you in the description if you missed it, if y'all would want to see a video explaining how I get the book covers and make them all the same size to print out, how I track my stats and turn them into graphs in Canva. And it seems like quite a few of you would be interested in that video. So I do have plans to make that one for you and combine it with some more sort of behind the scenes info, I guess, about how I make my reading journal and sharing some of my favorite or most used supplies and so on. Hopefully just making it a helpful video in general for anyone who's wanting to make their own reading journal and looking for some tips. So look out for that. I'm not sure exactly when I will be posting it just yet, but hopefully in the next couple months I will find a good time slot for it and I'll be able to share it with you. In March, I managed to finish 8 books: Scattered Minds, Driven to Distraction, Scorched Grace, The Intimacy Experiment, Hester, Monstress Book 2, Shades of Grey, and Parable of the Sower. When I get to my stats, you may notice that there are actually 9 books included in the stats, and that's because, as I mentioned in last month's video, I'm including Severina's stats in my March stats because I did technically finish Severina in March, but I already included it in my February spreads since it was our book club pick. Moving over to my stats spread, I'm including a couple new stats that I haven't included before. It was a little hard to fit them all on one page, but I did my best. And there were many requests for me to show closer images of the stats as I'm talking about them, so I have included some B-roll footage showing the graphs and charts closer up so that you can see them better. Please let me know if this works for you. So running through my reading stats for March, starting with the genres I read from. I read 2 nonfiction books, 2 sci-fi, 1 fantasy, 1 historical fiction, 1 literary fiction, 1 mystery, and 1 romance. I always like to track some information about the authors I'm reading from so I can keep pushing to read more diversely. So in March, 66.6% of the authors I read from were white, but 22.2% of those were Jewish. I also read a book by a Latino author, an East Asian author, and a Black author at 11.1% each. As for the age demographic of these books, 100% of them were aimed at adults. Looking at the gender of the authors I read from, 55.6% were women and 44.4% were men. I read 100% of the books I read in March in English, but one of them was translated, and Yoda decided to make a cameo. As for the format, I consumed these books in 44.4% were audiobook, 22.2% were physical book, 22.2% were mixed media, as in listening to the audiobook and reading the physical book simultaneously, and 11.1%, as in one book, was an ebook. Looking at the authors' nationalities, 6 of them were American, 1 was British, 1 was Guatemalan, and 1 was Hungarian Canadian. Then we have a new stat that I'm trying to track, so I'm just calling it REP, and I'm just tracking whether there's any neurodiversity, mental illness, or disability rep in the books I read. In March, 62.5% of the books I read had some neurodiversity representation, 12.5% had representation for mental illness, and 25% had disability representation. Another new stat I thought would be interesting to include is looking at if the authors I'm reading from are new to me or repeats. In March, 77.8% of the authors I read from were new authors for me, and 22.2% were repeat authors. Yet another new stat. I know I got a little carried away, it's fine, but type of book is something I thought would be interesting to track. So in March, 55.6% of the books I read were novels, 22.2% were nonfiction, 11.1% novellas, and 11.1% comics. My trusty where I got it pie chart, or in this case donut chart, I guess, 44.4% of the books I read I owned a physical copy of, 22.2% were from my library, 22.2% I got from NetGalley as ARCs or ALCs, and 11.1% I read from the Kindle app. Looking at the years that these books were published, only one year had more than one book. I was pretty spread out in March, so 2022 had 2 books, and then 2023, 2021, 2011, 2009, 1999, 1995, and 1993 had 1 each. As for my star ratings in March, I had 0 1 stars, 2 2 stars, 2 3 stars, 1 4 star, and 4 5-star reads. The 4-star read was Severina. And last but definitely not least, the LGBTQIA plus rep in the books that I've been reading. 66.7% of the books I read did not have LGBTQIA plus rep, and 33.3% did. And I also noticed just now, as I'm recording this voiceover, that I flipped the labels on the sections. I wrote present on the absent section and absent on the present section, so I'll have to fix that. I also thought it might be interesting to include the total number of pages I read this month and the total number of hours I listened to. So in March, I read 1,649 pages and listened to 45 hours of audiobooks. Now that my March overview and stats spreads are finished, it's time to get started on my book entry spreads, my favorite part. March was a really good reading month for me. Half of the books I read, I gave 5 stars, which is not completely out of the realm of possibility for me because I do tend to give out 5 stars, not super easily, but I don't have unachievable standards for a 5-star read. I have never particularly shied away from giving a book 5 stars if I feel I want to give it 5 stars. So all that being said, it's been a good reading month. Starting as always with our book club pick for the month, which was Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. And this is my second book by Octavia E. Butler. I previously had read Kindred, And I've been really looking forward to reading this book, this duology really, for a long time, and I'll say it didn't disappoint. I decided to include a few quotes from the book, as I like to do. The first one was, "In order to rise from its own ashes, a phoenix first must burn." And the second one was, "Like her, I believe in something that I think my dying, denying, backward-looking people need." I also ended up including 2 quotes within the body of my review here, or my book entry. One was from the introduction, which was written by Gloria Steinem, and she said, "If there's one thing scarier than a dystopian novel about the future, it's one written in the past that has already begun to come true." And the other one from the book itself, "I intend to survive." I also ended up adding one more little quote to that blank area underneath the images, which was, "Kindness eases change." As for my review of Parable of the Sower, I gave it 5 stars. I thought it was fantastic. I will say it is very dark and graphic in its violence. It is not a particularly happy or enjoyable book to read. It's set in 2024, that's where the book begins, and it's the vision that Octavia E. Butler had for the future as she was writing this in the early 90s, looking around her, seeing all of the problems plaguing society, and imagining where they might go if we didn't take action to redirect them. The protagonist of this story is Lauren, who begins quite young and spends the majority of the novel as a young adult at 18, and she's really searching for meaning. She's trying to figure out who she is, what her purpose is, trying to make sense of this pre-apocalyptic, dystopic world that she lives in California, where water and food are scarce, drug addiction and violence are on the rise, and wealth disparity and poverty are at an extreme. She rejects the Baptist religion of her father and begins to gather observations of the world into a journal that turns into essentially a holy book for a new religion she is building called Earthseed. There's certainly a lot of Butler's musing on religion in this book, which I found quite interesting. Butler also doesn't shy away from looking the real threats of continued life on Earth in the face, diving headfirst into really difficult topics like climate change, human apathy and cruelty, unequal access to education, privatization of natural resources and land, misogyny, racism, and slavery, among many others. Like I said, this was not a particularly enjoyable read, but it was prophetic and visceral and painful and raw and deeply confronting, because I really do feel that we are not as far away from this future as we might like to think. And sticking our heads in the sand and ignoring where we're going is only going to get us there faster. Ignorance and apathy are not the way to go. Definitely very thought-provoking, emotionally draining. Like I said, very graphically violent. I will pop up my book card on the screen so you can see all of the trigger warnings that I could think of as I was reading. This is definitely one you might need to be in the right headspace for to fully appreciate and to get through. Moving on to my second read in March, which was Shades of Grey by Jasper Fforde, and this was my first time reading from this author, but it certainly will not be the last. I thought it would be kind of fun to put these 2 books side by side because in some ways they are very similar, even though they are also incredibly different. Shades of Grey is also a vision of the future, science fiction with a dystopian bent to it, but in Fforde's case, the book is incredibly lighthearted and quirky and comedic in its tone. Not to say that it doesn't explore any deeper issues, because it definitely does, especially social hierarchies and false communism that presents itself as for all people, while really prioritizing those at the top of a social pyramid, fear of difference and authoritarianism. But it does it, like I said, in such a lighthearted, funny way. It's incredibly comedic. The protagonist is so funny. I loved hanging out in his head, even though he is by no means a perfect person. He is just kind of endearing in his bumbling earnestness in everything he does. This book has such a fascinating concept at its core, which is that humanity has, for whatever reason, lost their ability to see color in its full spectrum. And the majority of people can't see color at all. All they see is shades of gray. But the people who do have the ability to see color tend to only see hints of one color or one color family. And because of this, there's developed this social hierarchy where those who are able to see colors more strongly or more clearly are raised higher than those who can see color to a lesser degree or not at all. And people group by their colors, and marriages and reproduction is centered around the idea of strengthening the color line, of trying to have offspring who have stronger vision in a particular color in the hopes of raising their children up in society. And all of the ramifications of this structure of their ability to see color being the core tenet, I suppose, of their society is really extrapolated in so many different ways. It's really fascinating to read how society is different because of this shift and all of the ways that it ripples out into how people interact and what's important to them, how they live their lives, how they conduct their relationships. Eddie, the protagonist, was great, and I also loved Jane, who was the perfect foil for him and also just an awesome badass character in her own right. It turns out that this book was written about a decade ago and is only now getting a sequel in the next year or two. So I feel like I read it at the right time, so I don't have to wait too long to read the second book, because I definitely will be reading the second book. Lots of fun. I highly recommend it if you're looking for dystopian sci-fi that is also very tongue-in-cheek and funny while having very complex world building, being very clever and thoughtful. The quotes I decided to include from Shades of Grey were, "I didn't set out to discover a truth. I was actually sent to the outer fringes to conduct a chair census and learn some humility. But the truth inevitably found me, as important truths often do, like a lost thought in need of a mind. And if you can't find the correct answer, then you're obviously asking the wrong question." I'll pop up the book card here so you can see any potential trigger or content warnings for this one. But it was definitely super interesting to read two books from the same genre that had such different tones and explored the idea in two completely different directions in the same month. Moving on to Hester. This is a historical fiction that imagines the life of Hester from the Scarlet Letter, which I have never read, but I received an ALC, an advanced listening copy from the publisher, and it sounded really interesting, so I decided to read it anyway. And I'm really glad I did, because even without the context of the original source material that it's based on, I absolutely loved this book. I decided to include a couple quotes from Hester. The first one is actually my favorite quote from the whole month, I would say, which is, "And if I told it to my daughter, then she would know my secrets. And if I told it truthfully, she would know my pain. And if I told it right, she would learn everything I know about love and desire and the colors, about this world and the hidden world, about the man with the red and gold voice who was almost the ruin of me, and she would know how I survived." And they say witch, but what do they mean? Which is a reason to kill you? Which might be someone to heal you? Which can be the devil? Or which can be a woman so beautiful she makes you lose your sense? They've got so many ways of calling you a witch. They just change it to how it suits them. And I just love this. I thought it was so beautifully written. Our main character, Isabel, is instantly likable. She's very well developed. She has a crystal clear voice, and she has so many passions and fears and hopes and dreams, and has a unique talent in that she has synesthesia, where she sees colors when she reads or hears people speak. Words and letters are in color for her, and that's where the infamous Scarlet A comes from. She learns from an early age from her mother to hide her special talent, her difference, because it would put her potentially at risk, as her grandmother, who also had synesthesia, was tried as a witch because of it. She eventually gets married and moves from Scotland to Salem in the United States, and the life she expected to have when she arrives doesn't come to pass. And it follows her journey of finding her own internal strength of developing friendships that can support her and sustain her, of learning her own power, learning to trust in herself, and eventually becoming a mother and passing on everything she's learned to the next generation. And I just thought it was so beautifully written. I really felt for Isabel. I was so attached to her by the end of the novel. I hated the villains so much, with such a visceral, passionate hatred. I basically couldn't put it down until I finished it. I was listening constantly because I just needed to know what happened. So definitely recommend Hester if you are ever into historical fiction. If that's a genre you ever read, you might really enjoy it, because I did. I'm going to split the page on the left into two, and these are the two nonfiction books I read in March, both of them about ADHD. I'm not going to go too in depth talking about my reviews of these books, because I do have a reading vlog video coming up in 2 weeks where I am going to be talking about all 4 of the books that I'm reading about ADHD, these 2 and the second 2 that I'm reading in April. I will give all my thoughts there. So I will read the quotes I decided to include, but other than that, I'm going to hold out for that video. So definitely check it out if you want to hear my thoughts on 4 books written about ADHD. The first of the 2 was Driven to Distraction, and the quotes I decided to include from this book were, "One of the cardinal symptoms of ADD is impulsivity. What is creativity but impulsivity gone right?" And "It is arbitrary, really, where the line of diagnosis is drawn, where normal leaves off and ADD begins. And yet, as Edmund Burke remarked in differentiating night from day, though there be not a clear line between them, yet no one would deny that there is a difference." And the second book, Scattered Minds, the quotes I decided to include from this one were, "Learning about the psychological and biological mechanisms of ADD gives a map to the self, but only a map, no more. It is still up to the individual to plot the course. And there is no path toward oneself that leads away from the pain." And lastly, "Humanity does need people capable of seeing past the official line, unwilling or unable to obliterate their conscious awareness of what is wrong in the world." As you can see, I gave Driven to Distraction 2 stars and Scattered Minds 3 stars. I will explain all about that in the upcoming video. Moving on to the final spread for book entries, I have 3 more books to write about here, starting with 2 quarter-page sized entries for Scorched Grace and The Intimacy Experiment, and a full-page spread for Monstress. Scorched Grace I gave 2 stars. This was another ALC I had from the publisher, and unfortunately this one just didn't work for me. This is a mystery novel, and our protagonist is Sister Holiday, a queer nun, and she's a bit of a amateur sleuth, and there's a fire. There's some deaths, and she decides she's going to figure out what's happening. She's going to solve the mystery. And I just didn't really connect to this one. The writing style was very much stream of consciousness. Sister Holiday herself, for me, was really the draw. That's why I wanted to read the book. She sounded awesome, and unfortunately, she just didn't quite work for me. I found her quite pretentious and inauthentic, almost like a high school student trying to seem more edgy than they are. I also didn't love how she talked about her brother after he suffered an assault, or the way that she was pretty blatantly biphobic toward the woman that she was apparently in love with. The mystery itself was also not particularly engaging. I wasn't very intrigued. I didn't care enough about any of the characters to want to know who was doing all of these things. It just didn't land for me. So 2 stars. The Intimacy Experiment, on the other hand, was a totally cute romance with a little bit of a spin. We have a former sex worker turned sex educator and a rabbi as our love interests. And our former sex worker turned sex educator is also bisexual. It was really great bisexual rep, which was lovely. And I thought this was cute. It was pretty run-of-the-mill. It didn't do anything too extraordinary outside of having really interesting characters as our leads. I wish we could have had more in the vein of women reclaiming their own pleasure and sex positivity, because one of our protagonists is a sex educator, and because of the basic plot of this book has so much to do with that. I think there was a bit of a missed opportunity there. I also found some of the relationship development was a little bit lackluster, I think, because the author was maybe more focused on exploring each character individually, which was very interesting. But as much as I liked both of them and I was rooting for them, I didn't feel too much for them. just because we didn't get a lot of their development romantically throughout the book, even though that's kind of the point. So for me, this was just middle of the road. It wasn't bad by any means. I enjoyed reading it, but it also wasn't fantastic. So 3 stars from me. The final book I finished in March was Monstress Book 2 by Marjorie M. Liu. I expected to love this because I adored Book 1, and Book 2 continued to be amazing. This is a very dark, high fantasy comic with a sapphic protagonist in Make a Half-Wolf, who is just all around an epic character. She is so badass, she's resilient, she is hardcore, she is independent and strong and ruthless, but she also has a tiny little kernel of herself open and vulnerable for love and care and attachment. And watching her relationships, especially with Kippa and Zin, develop through this second book was so lovely to see. I adore both Kippa and Zin. We got a bit more of their backstories as well, which was great. And just this world, I mean, I was blown away when I read the first 3 volumes, and it just continues to be such a complex, well-built, well thought out world that feels so vivid and real, especially because of Takeda's incredible artwork. The artwork in this comic is absolutely mind-blowing. Literally every page is a masterpiece. I was constantly in awe reading both the first and the second book. This is an incredibly complex world in terms of how many different races there are. There's so much deep lore. There's a lot of complexity in the political interactions between different races and those tensions. This book goes fully into war mode, and just like the first book, although maybe even more so, this is a very violent, gory, graphic, heartbreaking story. It's very intense. I would say secondary genre to the fantasy would be horror, so definitely keep that in mind if you're not one for violence in what you read. This is also a visual medium, and there is a lot of violence, blood, and gore. Definitely check out the trigger content warnings on the book card. But I just am in love with this story. I think it's so fascinating. I love following Meika on her journey. And I also love how unabashedly feminist and gay this comic is. Almost every single character with any power whatsoever is a woman, which is fantastic. All the world leaders, all the leaders of powerful sects, all the generals and warlords and matriarchs of groups. It's all badass women, and I love it. And so many of them are gay, and it's fantastic. So many depictions of sapphic relationships, and especially in the high fantasy genre, which is so male-dominated in authors and readers. So many high fantasy books are focused on predominantly male characters or male-led. So many high fantasy books are written with heavy male gaze that reading Monstress, something that is so incredibly political and complex, very high fantasy, very dark and gory, and exploring real issues, especially in this second book, getting into the horrors and realities of war on such a visceral level, and it being told from a female perspective, female author and artist, female protagonist, and all of the major characters really being strong, badass, amazing, incredible, even if they're evil women. It's such a breath of fresh air. I absolutely love it. I also love the writing in this comic. So the couple quotes I decided to include here were, "To hope is to ask for a possibility, just a chance at something better. The smallest, most fragile hope will keep a person fighting, no matter how impossible the odds. I know this now. And there is no more divine reverberation than the one that comes from gentle acts, to others and to oneself." And lastly, "From the darkness we emerged, resurrected inside new selves we could not have dreamed of becoming, and our enemies, who thought us dead, who tried to murder us with hate, fled from our rebirth in despair at having made us stronger." So good. So good. And now I'm really sad because there's one more volume I can read on its own, but I'm going to have to wait a year for the next one, and another year for the next one, and on and on and on until this finishes. And I'm not okay. I'm not okay with that. How do people survive reading comics that are still being released? Because this is really my first time getting into an ongoing comic, or comics at all really, and I hate it. I want to read the whole thing. I can't do this. Last but not least, I'm going to flip back to the yearly spreads at the beginning of my journal and fill them out for March, starting with the index, inputting the new spreads that I created. Then filling out my 2023 reading tracker. I've now read 29 books out of my 100 book goal. Skipping over my book bracket spread and moving on to my series tracker, I can fill in 3 more volumes of Monstress and add volume 7. I also started 2 new series in March, Shades of Grey and Parable of the Sower, or Earthseed, I think is what the series is called. So adding 2 books for each, since they're both duologies, or at least Shades of Grey I think is intended to be a duology. Filling in my 2023 reading goals, I read 1 book over 500 pages in March, so that's my doorstopper. I also read 2 nonfiction books and 1 book written by a Canadian author. I was able to fill in 2 more squares of my book bingo, romance with bi rep because of the intimacy experiment, and comic or graphic novel with disability rep for Monstress because our protagonist Meka is an amputee. And the final yearly spread I'm updating is my Reading Around the World spread. I have 2 more countries to fill in from my reading in 2023, both Guatemala and Hungary. And I decided to take this opportunity to add all the countries I read from in 2022 as well, so I could get a clearer picture of where I'm at overall in my reading goal. And that brings us to the end of this video. I'll do a quick flip through of my March spreads here so you can see them in all their glory. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the 8 books I finished in March and seeing how I set up my reading journal. I'm really glad y'all seemed to enjoy this format when I did it for the first time last month. I really love being able to tie in both my reading wrap-up for the month and my reading journal spreads, and being able to share those with you every month is lots of fun. As always, please let me know in the comments if you've read any of the books I talked about in this video. I want to hear your thoughts. And also let me know if you've added any of these to your TBR after hearing me talk about them, because that's always fun. Thank you, as always, to my patrons for your support. I appreciate you all so much. If you at home want to join the squad, or maybe you want to join our book club, feel free. There's a link in the card and in the description box down below. We would love to have you. And with that, I'm going to get going. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next video. Bye, friends.